Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, South Africa's #1 business news website. And today we're looking under the hood of sustainable finance. Now, it is something of a buzzword. It's crept into our lexicon of late. And if you just look at the extent of the estimated financial needs to respond to climate change, one can see why. I was looking at an OECD study that reckons the cost of transforming the world's energy system alone is estimated to be between, it's a pretty big range, 1.6 to $3.8 trillion annually until 2050. And clearly, it's going to be one of the big talking points as we head into COP27, the African COP, as it's being held in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh. And a lot of talk around the climate finance pledges to achieve and surpass the $100 billion a year goal. Well, my next guest has had her finger on the pulse of these broad trends for a few years now. Silvia Pavoni is the founding editor at Sustainable Views at the Financial Times. And Silvia, welcome. You spent the bulk of your career writing for The Banker, then later as economics editor. So like me, you've seen the rise of climate or sustainable finance from sort of the backwaters of the global financial conversation now to almost the very center. What do you see as the driving force behind this popularity?
Hi, Michael, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to talk to you. And you're absolutely right. So initially, the conversations I was having with bankers, with analysts, economists, but even to a certain degree, government officials and regulators, was around green and green risks and what does that mean for banks' balance sheets, for their stability. Do they need to consider it? Is it just one of those nice to have things that it would be good to have in good times, but actually not really necessarily top of anyone's agenda? And things have changed so rapidly in recent times. And one of the reasons why I pitched the idea internally at DFT to create a platform specifically on policy and regulation, which is what we do, came from those conversations I was having, in particular, for example, with risk managers, risk officers at big international institutions. And so they were saying, the central banks may start asking us about this kind of stuff because it may potentially have repercussions for the stability of the whole system. And they were right, because now we see the Bank of England here in the UK, but also the European Central Bank. We are also seeing the Fed and the financial markets regulator, the SEC, in the States, looking at climate risk. And so they were absolutely correct. And it is a big issue that now has to do not only with the ones that have been warning us all along about the importance of ensuring that the environment is in good shape, and the scientists warning us about the risk of climate change, but it's very much now part of financial markets and financial systems conversations. And so the big drivers are, well, regulators. Again, that's one of the areas that we as Sustainable Views focus on, but also to a certain degree, interest from investors. Some of them very much convinced about the importance of deploying the capital that they're managing to put it in towards good, to make sure that not only generates a return, but also that it doesn't harm the environment and society. You also hear business leaders now telling you that it comes from within, from staff. So staff is asking about the policies that big organizations, be it in energy to a certain degree as well, but also banking, asset management, and other. They're asking about policies when it comes to environmental concerns, when it comes to social concerns, when it comes to diversity. And so it seems that it does feel that there is a bit of a change of the zeitgeist, doesn't it? It's not just, again, at the margins of business.
Yeah, the zeitgeist, I think, sums it up beautifully in one word. That the challenge, though, is always when you get into the weeds of these things, because it's very nascent. The taxonomy around what you're reporting on is still being finalized. I think the EU is slightly ahead of us here in South Africa. And if you look at the various, take emissions, for example, and I know it goes beyond that when you talk about social or governance issues, but if you just use the E, scope 1, scope 2, pretty straightforward. For a bank, if you look talking about scope 3 emissions, Well, now you're getting into, your supply chain and who you're funding, and looking through your book, and, how do you measure emissions intensity? And I mean, that really is where the complexity is starting to come in. But when you look at incentives here, because certainly from a regulatory perspective, it is about using incentives, positive, negative incentive. What incentivizes financial organizations and businesses to implement these sustainable finance principles through their organizations?
So again, to a large degree, is down to the regulators and what they are expected to be doing. But there is also a component of what the public actually feels. So there is a public perception, public opinion component, and the fear, to be honest, also of litigation. Because we are seeing cases, not so much at the moment in financial services, but we're seeing cases of energy companies being taken to court and then being ordered to commit to certain climate targets. We're also seeing companies taking each other to court, competitors, over greenwashing claims, or rather over claims that they perceive to be unfounded over sustainability. And so these are the drivers that I see are particularly important, in addition to actually personal conviction, because you do see that when the leader at the top of an organization, and we know this obviously, it's of course it's part of human nature, when the big boss tells you this is important, the whole organization tends to move. So those I see are the big drivers. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's when we even start to define what is the E, the green, right? The environmental component of ESG, it's a new language. It's a completely new terminology. And the regulators are kind of telling us about the definition of those words. And so they're being the grammar police, right? They're setting the rules. And the taxonomy that you mentioned, which is causing in the EU, but also there are so many other taxonomies being developed around the world. So the definition of what is green keeps on changing, doesn't it? And you need to learn a whole new language, and you need to be able to interact with others using the appropriate terminology and being constrained by definitions that perhaps you don't like.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, as we develop this, because there's a lot of cynicism, because you see sometimes the definitions changing depending on whether or not the circumstances warrant it, with the energy crisis in Europe, and backpedaling a little bit on gas, and now including nuclear. Yeah, all of these things are evolving. But I do think, broadly speaking, ESG disclosures are really seen as a good way to hold organizations accountable as responsible entities here. And that's all we really have. From your vantage point, are you seeing this growing cynicism? And also, do you see ESG as an important component in terms of disclosure when we have this broader conversation around being, responsible corporate entities, responsible citizens in the broader sustainability conversation?
You're opening a bit of a Pandora box there, because there are so many conversations around disclosures. It's very important. Of course, transparency is important, right? And you need to measure. You need to define what is sustainability. Just thinking about the green component. What are the components that will tell you how green you are? And then how do you disclose that information? And do you need to disclose it in a way that is relevant only to investors, to shareholders, or do you also need to disclose it in a way that is useful to other parts of societies, to the regulators, to your employees, to consumers, to environmentalist groups, so anyone else that wants to understand you? And there are so many proposals. In fact, there is a little bit of fatigue across companies, because, of course, policymakers are ensuring, I guess, that everyone else is included in this conversation, and they issue, draft proposals, and then are out for discussion, and everyone needs to provide feedback. So you have proposals by there are a number of, without getting too much into this crazy alphabet soup of disclosure, but you have your TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. You have SASB, which looks specifically at what investors need, and then SASB is now being included with others. within the efforts of the international standard setter, the IFRS, and they have created a new body, the International Sustainability Standards Board, and they're also working on something. And so you have all these different bodies, and it's true that there are efforts to try and merge and converge towards, I guess, one gold standard or these building blocks. This is how the ISSB likes to talk about it, but the different approaches, and it's very complex, and it's also very important to find a way in which we can talk about sustainability in the same way that we can relatively easily talk about financial statements.
Yeah, and until we can do that, I think it's very difficult for capital markets to be the drivers of that change, because ultimately that's what you want to happen. You want capital to flow to businesses that are thinking about this holistically, that understand the long-term risks at play here, be they physical risks, be they transition risks, or be they legal risks, and be able to manage those in a way that you are being, fiduciary, a responsible custodian of investor capital here. But are there any drawbacks when it comes to ESG disclosures from what you've just discussed, despite the complexity? What do you see as any potential drawbacks?
So the drawbacks is that we may end up thinking about sustainability disclosures as a bit of a box-ticking exercise. So it becomes just due diligence. And that only satisfies, I guess, the regulator, your compliance, that's done. But ultimately, it may not lead us to the end goal, which is that of decarbonizing the economy and transitioning towards a greener and, as you pointed out also earlier in our chat, a just economy. So that's one of the risks. There is also the risk of, raising cynicism, because then you see all these kind of efforts and people just coming out with estimates, because of course we don't have the real numbers. It's very difficult, or the real information is very difficult to go and it is objectively difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, companies really haven't been used to being in charge, and they should have, and monitor what goes on through our supply chains. So they don't even have the tools. So the ones that maybe are more attuned to that kind of responsibility may find themselves in a better position. The others have a long way to go. So those are the risks. And we're also seeing more broadly a bit of a backlash against ESG because, again, at a time of energy crisis, rising energy prices, a recession likely coming, inflation hitting so many markets. I mean, it's difficult to perhaps in some cases find an argument for supporting this kind of investments. And also we've had scandals. We've had scandals, related to greenwashing. We've had companies then having to backtrack because we committed to reaching that goal by that time, and now that we feel that the regulator may come down on us and holding us accountable, we'll see. So these are the challenges that I see.
Very similar to the challenges we're seeing here in South Africa as well. Because, I mean, and if you look at the European energy crisis, I think it may be used for those to call for the status quo, to point to those calling for a decarbonized energy system to say, look, we told you so. But on the other hand, I think you could quite easily rebuff it to say, the fact that Europe is still so reliant on a fossil fuel like gas, which is being used by an autocratic regime like Vladimir Putin's at the moment, indicates the necessity and the need to get away from fossil fuels and to build energy security and independence. And renewable energies both decarbonize and they give you that geopolitically as well. But it's about the pace of this transition. And that's what we're arguing about here in South Africa. We're still very coal reliant. How do we do it in a way that also manages the S, with a capital S, the socioeconomic impacts on coal workers, and how do we get them retooled and reskilled in these new supply chains, building up renewable solar and wind plants. So it is very complex, but finance has a critical role to play here. And I mentioned the big figure, right up front. Could you just unpack what blended finance is and how it benefits developing countries like South Africa, for example?
Sure, it is such an interesting subject, and you're absolutely right about what is happening in Europe. Because if, on the one hand, it has perhaps reinvigorated those that were in favor of keeping coal, even in some cases, and other fossil fuels around. It has also gave, impetus to the proponents of renewables because they would represent uh, independence from certain
Mm-hmm.
regimes that have been providing gas to the continent. On blended finance, I mean, it's such an interesting subject, and of course, ahead of COP27, I feel like that it's a subject that is being talked about a little bit more, and of course, we heard all the controversy and drama even around the World Bank president, David Malpass, because initially it seemed that he wasn't quite convinced that climate change was man-made, and so there was that reinvigorated, I think, conversations around the role of development banks. Now, blended finance is essentially a way in which the argument goes. Public money, in a sense, so the money coming from these development banks that are funded by governments, a group of governments, is put together with private sector money. So that's the expertise, and to a certain degree also the capital of these development banks is put to use in a sense of reducing the risk for private sector investors looking at climate-related projects in Africa, for example. And we know you mentioned some figures of what is needed. The African Development Bank, you know, that they estimate that there is a need of 1.6 trillion for the region between 2020 and 2030 to meet climate goals, right? Which is quite big. And if we think about the capital at disposal of development banks, we're talking billions, right? We're not talking trillions. And of course, if we think about what these private sector investors and asset managers have at their disposal, then we get way closer to what is needed. And so in Sustainable Views, we just published an opinion piece by the chair of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is a UN convened association. And he was calling exactly for this, for blended finance. Now, I know that there are some others within the development banking world also calling for this. So I was talking a few months ago with the CFO of the New Development Bank, which is the development bank that groups actually also South Africa with China and Brazil. And Leslie Marsdorp, and he was also calling for a greater use of development banks' own capital to absorb these kind of risks, which in practical terms means that if a project is perceived by the private sector as being too risky because of a variety of reasons, the development bank would take the first loss, right? And so that the risk on the project reduces. But then I was talking just yesterday with someone else really relatively, well, not quite senior, within another development bank, and he just described this whole concept as red herring, because anyway, the capital of these institutions is too small compared to the total amount needed to be flowing into those kind of projects to make really a difference for private sector investors. So it's an area that is fascinating because clearly there is a developmental need, but there isn't enough capital. And at a moment in which, of course, governments are kind of strapped because of recessions, crisis, dealing with inflation. I mean, just look at what's happening in the UK at the moment. It's quite scary. And you don't see them just looking actually exactly at the UK. We had a look at how, and I'm talking quite a lot, but I'm really, really enthusiastic.
No, it's fascinating.
We look at a report by the government just issued, and they were explaining where the funding from the Green Bond program went. And the money put next to international capital financing went down. So again, you need to consider, definitely need to come up with different solutions. Blended finance, many people are calling for it. The person I spoke to yesterday was saying, no, that's just a distraction. You need to focus on something else. So that's an area that we will definitely keep on monitoring here at Sustainable Views. And it's just fascinating. Because again, as you say, This is a problem that has been caused by developed industrialized countries, and the brunt of it now is being felt by others.
Yeah, and why it's one of the big sticking points at the various COPs. And I don't think, I mean, we realize how difficult it is to get a deal across the line at a global summit where you've got almost every country on earth at the negotiating table, and we're trying to push through a deal where you've got sovereign interests talking about the global common good. You've got this global north, global south debate happening. And yet, so far, we have reached significant consensus on a whole range of issues that do provide some encouragement, but more work needs to happen. And yes, while I agree with who you were chatting to yesterday on some level, when you're talking billions and you've got to leverage that to get trillions of dollars to flow in, it does seem insignificant. But public funders, they've got this explicit mission to support development. They've got higher risk thresholds. So clearly they do have a role to play here. And even if it's catalytic in terms of proving concept and first principles in key projects, say providing a new way of manufacturing green steel, for example, I think that's still an important role to play. So I definitely think that blended finance does have a role. As COP27 approaches, how do you think that this conference is going to address these important topics, sustainable finance, blended finance, particularly in terms of getting organizations to make more environmentally responsible financial decisions?
No, absolutely. And development banks do have a huge role to play. It's just finding the right vehicles, the right financial vehicles to channel and to really meet those goals. Now, COP27, I mean, it's the African COP, and of course, we lots of discussions about the terms of the expense of accessing finance through private markets, challenging for countries in developing markets. So the Egyptian finance minister was in London earlier this year talking to journalists and investors, and he was expressing exactly this concept, how challenging and how expensive it is to raise, for example, to issue a green bond from the region compared to a green bond issued elsewhere. And we know that green bonds, which are part of this huge bucket now, huge in relative terms, but fast growing bucket of sustainable finance debt tools, which in 2018, it was around 200 billion, according to Standard & Poor's data, mostly green bonds. And now it has grown to potentially at the end of this year, around $1.5 trillion. If we include all sorts of different tools, green bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, social bonds, sustainable bonds, so different financial products all related to ESG. So the issue of financing is definitely important. The issue of understanding risk and evaluating risk, important. The risk tolerance for certain investors, private sector investors, compared to multilateral organizations, government funding. It's going to be a really interesting discussion, and I hope it's going to be well attended. It's always difficult to predict what kind of commitments then governments will make at these events. But if last year's was Finance COP and it was almost expected to be Finance COP, I do hope actually that this one is the COP in which emerging markets and countries outside of the so-called industrialized world find a solution or start really talking seriously about what kind of solutions should be made available to them.
Well, I like that. An emerging market COP, and hopefully there's no cop out when it comes to reaching very tough decisions around things like agreeing to loss and damage and compensation. Based on your experience, and just as we reach the end of our conversation, I mean, you've been following the theme for some time. Do you have any predictions that you can make about how the implementation of sustainable financial practices might evolve from where we are now into the future?
It's an interesting question. So I think that there is the key areas are, again, information, right? So access to information. And what then you should do with that, and whether this is whether sustainability and ESG again, are they different? Are they the same? Is it the same as ethics? So we need to have sort those definitions out, have them clear in our minds before we decide, how to talk about it and where to put our money. So definitions, transparency is definitely going to be a big trend, and commitment, because as the former CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, would say, and had said to me in a recent occasion, the technology is there, the green technology is there. What is missing is willingness to act.
Yeah.
And so it's, again, almost impossible to predict what kind of decisions are going to be taken and how strong they will be, even thinking about what's happened with deforestation at COP26. We had the Brazilian government committing to stop illegal deforestation. Being illegal, you would hope that the government would, of course, be against it. So it's not perhaps a statement that is worth making in such on such a stage. And so it's quite difficult, of course, to anticipate what kind of important commitments may be made. But it is clear that there is a bit of a momentum building for stronger action, because also we're seeing the effects of climate change. From what you understand, these are very much the effects of climate change all around us and everywhere. And so I hope that this is going to spur everyone into action, that talking about potential drastic measures isn't going to be so off the table. It's difficult, as we know, for politicians. We hear it's very difficult to take tough decisions. Carbon taxation, so tough, but perhaps we are at a stage where we can't really avoid presenting those solutions, those tough solutions to the electorate.
And we see it here in South Africa. We had an organized business pushback against our carbon taxes, and the acting DG in our Treasury came out and he said, absolutely not. It shows a lack of vision. We have to act now. And it's hard to argue against that. Yes, we know businesses are facing a whole host of headwinds, from post-COVID supply chain issues to rising inflation, as you said, rising interest rates around the world. But if we reach some of those tipping points, the science does tell us that the feedback loops become ever more dangerous and negative. And so the risks there of doing nothing or even dragging your feet are just far too great. And that's why we have to be a lot more proactive, and why I'm certainly holding out hope for COP27. Silvia Pavoni, founding editor of Sustainable Views at Financial Times. Thank you so much for sharing your insights into sustainable finance with us here on Business Talk. Take care.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.